Every expert in that room had failed. Then she asked if anyone else had something to say. He set his toolbox down and took one step forward. His one sentence stopped the deal cold. The contract lay open on the mahogany table, its pages catching the late afternoon light that slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The woman in the charcoal suit, Sarah Mitchell, CEO of Hartford Capital, had her hands still raised, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Every expert in that room had failed. The investment bankers had presented their due diligence. The legal team had signed off. The board had nodded along. And now, a man in a faded navy blue polo shirt with a small logo over the left chest stood at the back of the room, his dented green metal toolbox with a brass latch resting on the floor beside him. Ethan Caldwell adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses with his thumb and forefinger, a habit he'd developed in another life. He took one step forward. The scuffed brown leather loafers made no sound on the polished floor. His shoulders were still slightly rounded, his posture that of a man who had spent years looking at the ground, but his pale blue eyes were fixed on a single paragraph in the contract. Clause 14, subsection C, he said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people lean forward to hear. The force majeure provision excludes acts of regulatory oversight by federal banking authorities. That's not standard. That's not legal. That's a poison pill designed to trigger if the SEC reviews the merger. The silence that followed was not the silence of people thinking. It was the silence of people who had just realized they had been standing on a trap door. Sarah Mitchell's hand lowered slowly. She looked at the contract, then at the investment banker across the table, Robert Langford, a broad-shouldered man in a navy blue tailored suit with a burgundy silk tie, his silver gray hair combed back, his pale gray eyes narrowing. Langford's lips pressed together. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice carrying the polished weight of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Ethan did not answer. He simply waited, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. The wire-rimmed glasses caught the light again. The faded polo shirt had a small fray at the collar, barely visible unless you were looking for it. And Langford was not looking for it. He was looking at the toolbox. "Maintenance," one of the junior associates whispered, loud enough for half the table to hear. "He fixes the projector." A few of the bankers exchanged glances. One of them, a younger man in a blue tie, let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh that was meant to be polite but carried the unmistakable shape of dismissal. The laugh lifted over a champagne glass that was not there, a sound that had been polished by years of boardroom dinners and country club handshakes. Ethan did not flinch. He checked his wristwatch, a simple, scratched Timex with a worn leather band, and then looked back at the contract. "That clause," he said, "would have exposed Hartford Capital to a liability of approximately $1.7 billion in the event of a regulatory review. The language is written to appear standard, but the exclusion of federal oversight is a deliberate omission. Any first-year corporate counsel would catch it. The fact that your legal team missed it suggests either incompetence or intent." Sarah Mitchell turned to Langford. "Robert?" Langford's jaw tightened. He reached for the contract, his gold signet ring catching the light, and scanned the page. His pale gray eyes moved back and forth, back and forth. The silence stretched. The junior associate who had laughed was no longer laughing. He was staring at his hands. "I want a copy of the contract," Ethan said. "And I want you to read the indemnification clause in Section 8. It references a parent company that does not exist in the SEC filings. You're signing a deal with a ghost." The room went cold. Not the cold of a temperature change, but the cold of a truth landing in a place where no one was prepared to receive it. Sarah Mitchell's assistant, a young woman with wide eyes and a cream cardigan, had already pulled out her phone and was typing furiously. The paralegal in the gray blazer had her hand over her mouth. Langford set the contract down. His face had lost some of its color. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice had lost its polish. It was rougher now, like a shoe scuffing against concrete. "You're a—" "He's right," Sarah Mitchell said. She had not taken her eyes off the page. Clause 14, subsection C, and section 8. I've been reading this contract for 3 weeks and I missed it. How did you see it? Ethan looked at her. His pale blue eyes were steady. I made a habit of reading the fine print when my wife was dying, he said. The hospital bills had clauses too. You learn to look for the thing that doesn't belong. No one spoke. The woman in the charcoal suit held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, not sympathy, but recognition. The kind of recognition that does not need words. Pause the deal, Sarah Mitchell said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a decision that would cost someone their job. Everyone out. Robert, I want your team in conference room B in 20 minutes. We're going to go through this contract page by page. Langford stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. He looked at Ethan, at the faded polo shirt, the dented green toolbox, the scuffed brown leather loafers, and for a fraction of a second, his pale gray eyes held something that was not anger. It was fear. The fear of a man who had just realized that the person he dismissed was the only one who had been paying attention. He walked out without another word. The junior associate followed, his laughter now a memory that would not age well. The room emptied slowly, the investment bankers gathering their papers, the paralegal clutching her tablet, the young woman in the cream cardigan still typing. Ethan walked back to his toolbox. He bent down, the brass latch clicking as he opened it, and placed the copy of the contract inside. He always made 2 copies. It was a habit his wife had taught him. Back up everything, because you never know when the world will try to take something from you. Wait, Sarah Mitchell said. He straightened, the toolbox in his hand, the worn khaki pants and the faded polo shirt catching the light one last time before he turned. She was standing at the head of the table, her hand extended. I don't know your name. Ethan, he said. Ethan Caldwell. Ethan, she repeated, as if testing the weight of it. I need you to stay. I need you to look at this contract. The whole thing. He looked down at his toolbox. The brass latch was warm from his hand. Outside, the city skyline was beginning to glow with the first lights of evening, and somewhere across town, his daughter Lily would be finishing her art class, her curly blonde hair tied back with a yellow ribbon, her small hands covered in paint. He had promised Marcus he would be back by 6 to finish the HVAC inspection on the 3rd floor. I have to pick up my daughter, he said. Sarah Mitchell nodded. Then bring her. I'll have a room made up. She can do her homework while you work. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The wire-rimmed glasses sat steady on his nose. The pale blue eyes held something that had not been there a minute ago. The faintest flicker of trust. All right, he said, but I need to call Margaret first. He pulled out his phone, the screen cracked in one corner, and dialed. Margaret Chin answered on the 2nd ring, her voice calm and steady, the way it always was. He explained quickly, and she said she would pick Lily up from school and bring her to the Hartford building. When he hung up, Sarah Mitchell was still standing at the head of the table. The conference room on the 42nd floor, she said. I'll have coffee sent up. Ethan nodded. He picked up his dented green toolbox, the brass latch catching the light one last time, and walked toward the door. His scuffed brown leather loafers made no sound on the polished floor. The wire-rimmed glasses caught the light, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been here before, in another life, in another suit, with a different name. But that was not who he was anymore. He was a single dad with a dented toolbox and a daughter who needed him home by 8, and he had just stopped a deal that would have bankrupted a company. The door closed behind him. The room was empty now, the contract still open on the table, the late afternoon light fading to amber. Sarah Mitchell stood alone, looking at the page where Clause 14, subsection C, had been marked with a single, precise underline. The woman's voice cut through the hum of the projector's cooling fan. "Wait." Ethan Caldwell stopped with his hand on the brass handle of the boardroom door. He did not turn immediately. He stood still for a moment, the dented green metal toolbox hanging from his left hand, the scuffed brown leather loafers planted on the polished mahogany floor. He could feel the weight of the room behind him, the disbelief, the confusion, the first stirrings of something that might become respect or might become resentment. He had seen both before. The woman in the charcoal suit rose from her chair. Her name, he would learn later, was Sarah Mitchell. She was the CEO of Hartford Capital, and she had just watched a man in a faded navy blue polo shirt tear a hole in the most important deal of her career. She was not angry. She was curious. "Please," she said. "Sit down." Ethan turned. His pale blue eyes met hers through the silver wire-rimmed glasses. He did not sit. He walked back to the table and set his toolbox down on the floor beside the empty chair at the far end. He did not take the seat. He stood behind it, his hands resting on the back of the leather chair, his shoulders still slightly stooped. "I'm the projector repairman," he said. "I don't think I belong at this table." Sarah Mitchell smiled. It was a small, tight smile, the kind that cost something. "You just saved my company about $17 million in the first year alone. I think you belong wherever you want to be." The other executives shifted in their chairs. Robert Langford, the lead banker from the other side, was still standing near the whiteboard, his silver-gray hair perfectly combed, his burgundy silk tie still knotted tight. He had not spoken since Ethan's sentence landed. His pale gray eyes were fixed on the contract in his hands, as if he expected it to change shape. "I don't understand," Langford said finally. "Who are you?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, the same one he had carried for the past 4 years. He flipped it open to a page marked with a yellow post-it note. The page was covered in his handwriting, neat, precise, the letters small and evenly spaced. It was the handwriting of a man who had once signed documents worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. "My name is Ethan Caldwell," he said. "I used to practice corporate law. I left the field about 4 years ago." The room went quiet again. Sarah Mitchell tilted her head. "You left corporate law to fix projectors?" "I left corporate law to pick up my daughter from school," Ethan said. The projector repair was what was available at 3 in the afternoon. It was true, every word of it. After his wife died, the exact time, 6:43 in the evening, the sound of the hospital corridor, the way his hands refused to shake even when he begged them to. He had walked out of his corner office on the 37th floor and never looked back. He had a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, a house that felt too large, and a schedule that no longer made sense. The law firm had offered him 6 months of leave. He had taken 2 weeks, then resigned. The maintenance job came from a classified ad. Hotel maintenance, flexible hours, no questions asked. He had walked into the interview in the same navy blue polo shirt he was wearing now, and Marcus Bell, the maintenance supervisor, had looked at his resume and laughed. "You're overqualified," Marcus had said, his bucket-sized coffee mug steaming on the desk between them. "I'm not," Ethan had replied. I need to be done by 3. Marcus had hired him on the spot. That was 4 years ago. 4 years of fixing air conditioning units and replacing light bulbs and listening to the quiet hum of buildings that never slept. 4 years of picking Lily up from school at 3:15, of making dinner, of reading bedtime stories in a voice that still remembered how to be gentle. 4 years of carrying a toolbox that had once held legal briefs and now held wrenches and screwdrivers and a small photograph of his wife tucked into the inner pocket. Sarah Mitchell was still watching him. "You saw a clause in a contract that 3 teams of lawyers missed," she said, "in about 30 seconds. "I saw a pattern," Ethan said. "I saw the same drafting error I used to find in my first year of practice. It's a common mistake. The lawyers who wrote it were probably junior associates working on a deadline. They copied a template from a different jurisdiction and forgot to update the reference to federal statute." He said it without arrogance. It was simply what he knew. His wife had taught him to read contracts this way, slowly, carefully, always looking for the one sentence that did not belong. She had been a better lawyer than he was. She had been better at everything. "I need you to review the entire contract," Sarah Mitchell said. "Not just the parts you saw, the whole thing." Ethan looked down at his toolbox. The brass latch was warm from his hand. He thought about Lily, sitting in the after-school program until 6, her small hands folded in her lap, waiting for him. He thought about Margaret Chen, his housekeeper, who always stayed late when he needed her, who had never once complained. "I'll need a quiet office and a coffee," he said. "And I'll need to make a phone call." Sarah Mitchell nodded. "You can use my office." Ethan picked up his toolbox and followed her out of the boardroom. He did not look back at Robert Langford, who was still standing by the whiteboard, his gold signet ring catching the light as he drummed his fingers on the edge of the table. He did not look at the other executives, who were whispering to each other in low, urgent voices. He walked through the door and into the corridor, the scuffed brown leather loafers making soft sounds on the marble floor. The office was on the 32nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the downtown skyline under a clear blue sky. A framed photograph of a young girl, Sarah Mitchell's daughter probably, sat on the desk next to a glass water pitcher. Ethan sat down in the leather chair, pulled out his phone, and called Margaret. "I'll be late," he said when she answered. "Can you stay with Lily until 8? "Of course, Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said. Her voice was calm, steady, the same voice she had used every time he had called with the same request. "I'll make her favorite pasta." "Thank you, Margaret." "You're welcome, Mr. Caldwell." He hung up and looked at the contract. It was thick, maybe 200 pages, bound in a dark blue folder with the Hartford Capital logo on the cover. He opened it to the first page and began to read. He read for 6 hours. He read through the dinner hour, through the evening, through the moment when the sun set and the city lights flickered on outside the window. He took notes in his leather-bound notebook, the silver pen moving steadily across the page. He found 9 more errors in the first 100 pages. He found a clause that would have allowed the other party to terminate the deal without penalty if the stock price dropped below a certain threshold. He found a provision that would have given them control of the company's intellectual property in the event of a merger. He found a drafting error that would have made the entire contract void under Delaware law. By midnight, he had a list of 17 fatal flaws. He closed the contract, set his pen down, and leaned back in the chair. The city stretched out below him, a grid of lights and shadows. He thought about Lily, asleep in her bed, the blue nightlight glowing in the hallway. He thought about his wife, the way she used to laugh when he found a mistake she had missed. He thought about the toolbox sitting on the floor beside him, the brass latch warm from his hand. In the morning, he presented his findings to the board. Robert Langford was there, his face pale, his silver-gray hair still perfectly combed. The other executives were there, seated around the long mahogany table, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Sarah Mitchell was at the head of the table, her hands folded in front of her, watching Ethan with an expression he could not quite read. Ethan stood at the far end of the table, his toolbox on the floor beside him, his leather-bound notebook open in his hands. He was still wearing the faded navy blue polo shirt and the worn khaki pants. He was still the projector repairman, but the room was different now. "The contract is unsalvageable," he said. "You need to walk away." The room erupted. Langford stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You can't be serious. We've been working on this deal for 6 months. "Then you've wasted 6 months, Ethan said. "The contract is designed to bankrupt you. Not immediately. Over the course of a year. The clause on page 47, section 12.3, allows the other party to demand full payment of the acquisition price if your revenue drops below a certain threshold. Your revenue drops every quarter. You would have been insolvent within 12 months. Langford's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He looked at the contract on the table, then at Ethan, then at Sarah Mitchell. "He's right," Sarah Mitchell said quietly. "I had my legal team check it this morning." The room fell silent. Ethan closed his notebook and looked at the faces around the table. He saw the same dismissive faces he had seen 100 times before. The ones that had looked at his worn khakis and scuffed loafers and decided he did not matter. But something was different now. They were not dismissing him. They were listening. He picked up his toolbox and waited. The silence in the boardroom was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of a room full of people who had already made up their minds and were simply waiting for the maintenance man to finish speaking, so they could return to the business of ignoring him. Robert Langford leaned back in his leather chair, the silver gray of his hair catching the afternoon light, and let a small, practiced smile settle on his lips. He did not look at Ethan. He looked at Sarah Mitchell, the CEO, and raised one eyebrow, a gesture that said everything. "Really? You're letting the projector repairman lecture us on federal banking law?" Sarah did not return the smile. Her eyes were still on Ethan, on the faded navy blue polo shirt, on the wire-rimmed glasses that he never took off, on the way he stood with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, as if he had all the time in the world. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice careful, "you said the clause contradicts federal banking law. Can you be more specific?" Ethan did not move. He did not step closer to the table. He did not pull out a document or a phone or a piece of paper. He simply tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is considering whether the question is worth answering. "Section 14, subsection C," he said. "The indemnification clause. It requires the acquiring company to assume all pre-existing liabilities, including those not disclosed during due diligence. That's a violation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Act of 1950, specifically Title 12, Section 1823 EE. Any agreement that modifies a bank's interest in an asset must be in writing and approved by the board. This clause attempts to circumvent that requirement by making the assumption of liability automatic." He paused. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning was suddenly audible, a low thrum that seemed to fill the space between breaths. "It's not a drafting error," Ethan continued. "It's a deliberate attempt to shift the risk of undisclosed liabilities onto your company after the merger is complete. If the FDIC ever reviews this contract, they will void the clause and your company will be left holding the bag for anything the bank failed to disclose, including potential lawsuits, regulatory fines, or insolvency." The man in the blue tie, the young associate, was already flipping through the contract. His fingers moved faster now, skipping past the introductory sections, searching for the page. His face went from confusion to concern to something close to panic. "He's right," the associate said, his voice cracking slightly. "Section 14, subsection C. It's exactly what he said." The room shifted. The three investment bankers in dark suits exchanged glances. The paralegal in the gray blazer stopped covering her mouth and started writing notes. The middle-aged secretary in the cream cardigan clutched her tablet to her chest, her eyes wide. Langford's smile did not falter, but it thinned, the corners of his mouth tightening just enough to reveal the calculation happening behind his pale gray eyes. "Even if that clause is problematic," Langford said, his voice smooth, practiced, "it's standard boilerplate. Every acquisition agreement includes language like that. It's never been challenged in court, and the FDIC has approved dozens of similar contracts." Ethan did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, the same one Margaret Chen, his housekeeper, had seen him write in 100 times. He flipped to a page, read something silently, then looked up at Langford. "The FDIC approved 12 contracts with similar language between 2018 and 2021, Ethan said. All 12 were challenged in federal court. 11 were voided. The 12th resulted in a $47 million settlement against the acquiring company. The precedent is established in Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation versus Hartford Capital Partners, 2022. The case is cited in every subsequent FDIC review." He closed the notebook and put it back in his pocket. Langford's face did not go pale. It did not register shock or defeat. But something shifted in his posture, a slight straightening of the spine, a tightening of the jaw. He was no longer dismissing the maintenance man. He was calculating the damage. Sarah Mitchell turned to Langford. "Robert, is this true?" Langford took a long breath, the kind a man takes when he is buying time to construct a narrative. "The clause is standard. It's been used in hundreds of deals." "That's not what I asked." The room went still again. The CEO's voice had lost its careful neutrality. It was sharp now, precise, the voice of a woman who had just realized she had been walking toward a cliff. Langford's hands moved to the table, palms flat, fingers spread. "Sarah, I can explain. The clause was drafted by our legal team. If there's an issue, we can amend it. It's not a deal breaker." "It's a deal breaker if it voids the entire agreement," Sarah said. "It's a deal breaker if it exposes us to $47 million in liability. It's a deal breaker if the man who fixes the projectors in this building is the only person in this room who noticed it." She turned back to Ethan. "How did you know that?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked down at his toolbox, the dented green metal box with the brass latch that his wife had bought him 5 years ago, the week before she died. He had been fixing a broken drawer in the kitchen, and she had laughed at him for using a screwdriver that was too small. She had gone out that afternoon and come back with a toolbox, a joke, a gift, a small act of love that he had carried with him ever since. "I read contracts," he said. "It's what I used to do." Sarah Mitchell stared at him. The other executives stared at him. Langford stared at the table, his hands still flat, his fingers pressed against the mahogany as if he could feel the deal slipping through them. "You used to be a lawyer?" Sarah asked. "I used to be a lot of things." Ethan reached down and picked up his toolbox. The brass latch clicked as he lifted it, a small noise that seemed to fill the entire room. "If you want my advice," he said, "don't sign that contract. Not without a complete rewrite of Section 14, and maybe have someone else look at Section 8 while you're at it. The non-compete clause is written so broadly it could prevent your company from operating in any state where the bank has a branch, which, according to the merger filing, is 47 states." He turned and walked toward the door, his scuffed brown leather loafers making soft sounds on the polished floor. "Wait." Sarah Mitchell's voice stopped him at the threshold. He turned, his hand on the doorframe, the afternoon light from the windows catching the silver wire-rimmed glasses, the faded blue of his polo shirt, the worn khakis that had seen 1,000 maintenance calls. "Please," she said. "Stay." Ethan Caldwell stood in the doorway, the toolbox in his hand, and looked around the room. He saw the same dismissive faces he had seen 100 times before, the same suits, the same polished smiles, the same certainty that a man in a maintenance uniform could not possibly know what he was talking about. But he also saw something else. He saw the young associate still staring at the contract, his pen hovering over the page. He saw the paralegal, her notes already filling a second sheet. He saw the CEO, her eyes fixed on him, waiting for an answer. He did not put down the toolbox. He waited. Langford's face went pale. He knew Ethan was right. The color drained from his broad cheeks in a slow tide, leaving his skin the color of old paper. His silver-gray hair seemed to lose its luster in the same moment. He stood at the head of the table, his polished black Oxfords planted on the polished floor, and for the first time in 30 years, Robert Langford had nothing to say. His hands dropped from the contract he'd been clutching. They hung at his sides like dead weights. The boardroom was silent except for the soft hum of the projector fan and the distant sound of traffic 12 stories below. Sarah Mitchell, the CEO in the charcoal suit, did not look away from Ethan. Her eyes were fixed on the man in the faded navy blue polo shirt, the man with the dented green toolbox at his feet, the man who had just pulled the foundation out from under a billion-dollar deal. Langford recovered quickly. He had spent 30 years learning how to recover. He straightened his burgundy silk tie, adjusted the gold signet ring on his right pinky, and cleared his throat with a practiced, dry sound. "This is absurd," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had never been questioned. "You're going to listen to a repairman? A man who fixes projectors? He's read a clause wrong. It happens. I've seen it before. Call a real lawyer." He gestured to a young associate in a blue tie who had been sitting in the corner, his jaw still hanging open from Ethan's earlier explanation. "Get someone from legal in here. Now." The associate fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling against the screen, but Sarah Mitchell raised a hand, and the associate froze. "I think we've already heard from a real lawyer," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was a tremor in it that hadn't been there an hour ago. She looked at Ethan. "You said there were 3 more fatal flaws. Show me." Ethan did not move immediately. Not move. He stood in his worn khakis, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, the silver wire-rimmed glasses catching the afternoon light. His pale blue eyes moved across the room, taking in the skeptical faces, the crossed arms, the barely concealed smirks. He had seen this look 100 times before. He had seen it from the receptionist at the Beverly Hilton, from the engineering head who dropped his USB like a candy wrapper, from every single person who looked at his frayed cuff and scuffed loafers and decided they knew everything they needed to know. He was used to it. He had made peace with it. But this time the stakes were different. This time, his daughter's future was sitting in a classroom 3 miles away, wearing a dress her mother had stitched by hand with yellow daisies on the hem. He stepped forward. His loafers made a soft sound against the floor. He reached into his green metal toolbox and pulled out a slim leather notebook, its cover worn and creased from years of use. He opened it to a page marked with a small piece of blue ribbon. "Clause 14, subsection C," he said, his voice calm and even. "It states that Hartford Capital retains the right to audit your financial records at any time without cause for a period of 10 years following the acquisition. That's standard. But Clause 14, subsection D, which is printed on the next page, adds a penalty of 0.5% of the total acquisition value for every day your records are not made available within 48 hours of request. That is not standard. That is a poison pill. He looked up. If Langford's firm requests an audit on a Friday afternoon, and you cannot produce the records by Sunday morning, you owe them $250 million by Monday, and they can request an audit every week for 10 years. The room went cold. Sarah Mitchell's face tightened. She picked up the contract and flipped through it, her fingers moving fast. "I don't see that clause," she said, her voice sharp. "It's in the fine print of the appendix," Ethan said. "Page 47, section 14, subsection D. It's printed in a font 2 points smaller than the rest of the document. You'd need a magnifying glass to spot it unless you were looking for it." He paused. "I was looking for it." Langford's face, already pale, went a shade whiter. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. His hands rose to his forehead, both palms pressing against his temples as if he were trying to hold his skull together. The gold signet ring caught the light. The young associate in the blue tie had stopped fumbling with his phone. He was staring at Ethan with something that looked like awe. Sarah Mitchell set the contract down. She turned to Langford. "Is this true?" Langford did not answer. He did not need to. The silence was answer enough. "Get out," Sarah said. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a door slamming shut. "You and your entire firm. Get out of my building. This deal is dead." Langford straightened his tie one last time. He tried to summon the old authority, the old dismissal, but it was gone. His eyes met Ethan's for a brief moment, and in that moment Ethan saw something he had never expected to see in Robert Langford's face. Fear. Not fear of the deal falling apart. Fear of what would happen next. Fear of the investigation that would follow, the partners who would ask questions, the clients who would not return his calls. Langford turned and walked out of the boardroom without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. The sound was soft, final, like a lock turning on a vault. The room exhaled. The executives shifted in their chairs. The paralegal in the gray blazer let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like an hour. Sarah Mitchell sat down heavily in her chair at the head of the table. She looked at Ethan, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You saved this company," she said finally. "Do you understand that? You saved every single person in this room." Ethan did not answer. He closed his notebook and slipped it back into his toolbox. He looked at his watch. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. He had 43 minutes to get to Lily's school. "I need to make a call," he said. He stepped out into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind him. The corridor was quiet, lined with glass-walled offices and abstract paintings. He pulled out his phone and dialed Margaret Chen's number. She answered on the second ring. "Margaret," he said, "I'm going to be late. Can you pick up Lily? I'll be home by 6. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said. Her voice was warm, steady, the same voice she had used every day for the past 4 years. "I'll have dinner ready. She's been asking about you." Ethan closed his eyes. He could see Lily's face, the curl of her blonde hair, the way she held his hand too tightly in the lobby. "Thank you," he said. "I'll explain everything when I get home." He hung up and stood in the hallway for a long moment, the phone still warm in his hand. The door to the boardroom opened behind him. Sarah Mitchell stepped out, holding a suit jacket over her arm. "Ethan," she said, "come back inside. We need to talk." He turned. She was holding a dark navy jacket. "It's my husband's," she said. "He keeps a spare in my office. Put it on. You'll look the part." He looked at the jacket. He looked at her. Then he took it and shrugged it on. It was a little broad in the shoulders, but it fit well enough. He followed her back into the boardroom, and for the first time in 4 years, Ethan Caldwell sat down at a table as an equal. The borrowed suit fit him well enough. It was charcoal gray, Italian wool, a cut that had probably cost $2,000 when it was new. It belonged to Sarah Mitchell's husband, who was roughly Ethan's size, and who, according to Sarah, had worn it exactly once, to a charity gala he'd hated. The fabric still smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. Ethan stood at the boardroom table, his silver wire-rimmed glasses catching the afternoon light, and he felt like a man standing in someone else's life. The room had changed. The same mahogany table, the same floor-to-ceiling windows showing the downtown skyline under a clear blue sky, the same glass water pitcher and tumblers, but the faces were different now. Robert Langford was gone, his silver-gray hair and broad shoulders having retreated through the brass-trimmed doors 40 minutes earlier, his burgundy silk tie loosened, his gold signet ring catching the light one last time as he'd raised a hand in a gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a dismissal. The 3 investment bankers who had flanked him sat in silence, their hands no longer covering their mouths, but folded on the table in front of them, fingers interlaced, knuckles white. Sarah Mitchell sat at the head of the table, her charcoal suit crisp, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made him want to look at the floor. She had excused Langford from the deal. She had asked Ethan to lead the negotiation. The words still felt strange in his memory, like a language he had once spoken fluently and had not used in years. The other side's lawyers arrived at 2:47 p.m., 3 men in navy suits, carrying leather briefcases and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong in a room full of people who were too polite to correct them. They sat across from Ethan, opened their briefcases, and laid out the revised contract. It was 73 pages. Ethan did not open it immediately. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses, cleaned them with the edge of his borrowed jacket, and put them back on. Then he opened the contract to page 12. His wife had taught him this. Claire. She had been a lawyer too, a partner at a firm that handled mergers and acquisitions, and she had a ritual. She would always start at page 12 of any contract, because that was where the lawyers got lazy. The first 10 pages were polished, checked, rechecked. The 11th page was the transition. Page 12 was where the mistakes lived. She had told him this on a Sunday afternoon, sitting cross-legged on their living room floor, a stack of documents spread out around her like a child's drawing, her hair falling across her face. He had watched her work and thought, I will never be that good. And then she had looked up and smiled and said, You will be better. You just have to read page 12. Page 12 of the revised contract contained a clause that redefined the term material adverse change to exclude any change that resulted from regulatory action. Ethan read it twice. Then he read it a third time. He set the contract down, picked up his silver pen, the one he had taken from the maintenance office, a cheap plastic thing with the company logo printed on the side, and circled the clause. Change this, he said. The lead lawyer across the table, a man with a receding hairline and a tie that was slightly too wide for the current fashion, leaned forward. That clause is standard. It's standard to exclude regulatory action from material adverse change clauses in industries that are not regulated, Ethan said. This is banking. You are trying to sell a company that holds deposits, makes loans, and is subject to examination by the Federal Reserve. If you define regulatory action as not material, you are writing a clause that says the buyer assumes all risk of the seller's compliance failures. That is not standard. That is predatory. The lawyer's face did not change, but his eyes moved. They dropped to the contract, then lifted back to Ethan. He had been dismissed in the first 3 seconds of looking at Ethan's worn khakis and scuffed leather loafers, and now he was trying to recalibrate. He did not know how to do it quickly enough. Sarah Mitchell spoke. "Mr. Caldwell is correct. Remove the clause." The lawyer nodded. His associate made a note. The contract continued. At 5:18 p.m., the negotiation concluded. The revised terms were accepted. The deal was restructured with a $1.7 billion liquidated damages clause that protected the company from exactly the kind of collapse Langford's original contract would have enabled. Sarah Mitchell signed her name. The other side's CEO signed his name. The notary stamped the documents, and then the room exhaled, a collective release of breath that sounded like a sigh from a body with 100 lungs. Sarah Mitchell stood and walked around the table to Ethan. She extended her hand. He took it. Her grip was firm, her palm warm, her eyes holding his. "I want to offer you your old job back," she said. "Head of legal, full partnership, whatever salary you want." Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at her hand, still clasped in his, and then he looked past her, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, at the city skyline. The sun was low, the glass of the buildings catching gold light, the streets below filling with cars and people heading home. Somewhere in that city, in a small house with a blue nightlight in the hallway, his daughter Lily was waiting for him. She would be sitting on the floor of her room, her curly blonde hair falling across her face, her brown eyes focused on a drawing or a book or a stuffed animal. She would be wearing the dress her mother had made, the one with the hand-stitched daisies, the fabric soft and worn from years of use. She would be waiting for him to walk through the door. "I'm not the same man," Ethan said. "I know," Sarah said. "I'm not asking you to be." He let go of her hand. He took a step back. His wire-rimmed glasses had slipped down his nose, and he pushed them up with his thumb, a gesture that was so familiar it felt like breathing. "I can't do full-time," he said. "I have to pick my daughter up from school at 3 o'clock. I can't travel. I can't work weekends. I can't take calls after 7 p.m. Sarah smiled. It was a small smile, a tired smile, the smile of a woman who had spent the last 36 hours watching her company almost die, and had watched a man in a borrowed suit bring it back to life. "Part-time consultant," she said. "Work from home, flexible hours. We'll pay you per project, plus a retainer. You review our contracts, you flag the problems, you tell us what to change. You never have to set foot in this building if you don't want to." Ethan considered it. He thought about his daughter's face when he walked through the door. He thought about the blue nightlight in the hallway. He thought about the hand-stitched daisies on her dress, the fabric his wife had chosen on a Saturday afternoon at a fabric store that no longer existed, the thread she had matched to a color she had called sunshine yellow. "One condition," he said. "Name it." "Margaret Chen stays on the payroll. She's my housekeeper. She's been with me since my wife died. She watches Lily when I can't be there. She is not replaceable." Sarah nodded. "Done." Ethan walked to the side of the room where his dented green metal toolbox sat, its brass latch catching the light. He picked it up by the handle. The weight of it was familiar, the brass key on the steel ring pressing into his palm. He had carried this toolbox into 100 rooms where no one had looked at him, where he had been invisible, where he had heard the things people said when they thought no one was listening. He had fixed projectors and replaced light bulbs and tightened screws, and he had listened. He had listened to every word. He walked toward the door. His scuffed brown leather loafers made no sound on the carpet. His shoulders were still slightly stooped, his posture still the posture of a man who had learned to make himself small. But his grip on the toolbox was firm. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. He pressed the button for the lobby, and the elevator began its descent, the numbers on the display ticking down, the building's floors passing like pages in a book. He thought about Lily. He thought about the ice cream shop on the corner of their street, the one with the red awning and the handwritten sign that said, "Fresh waffle cones." He thought about the way she laughed when the ice cream dripped onto her hand, the way she would hold his hand too tightly when they crossed the street, the small pulse in her wrist that he could feel through her skin. The elevator doors opened. He walked through the lobby, past the reception desk, where a woman in a cream cardigan clutched a tablet and watched him with wide eyes. He pushed open the glass door and stepped into the evening. The city lights were coming on. The sky was a deep blue, fading to orange at the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the smell of exhaust and asphalt and the faint sweetness of something cooking in a restaurant kitchen. Ethan Caldwell, a white Anglo-American man in his early 40s with fair pink skin and dirty blonde hair, wearing a borrowed suit and carrying a dented green toolbox, walked down the street toward his car. He was a single father who had just saved a billion-dollar company. He was a man who had read page 12 when no one else had. He was a man who always made 2 copies, who always had a backup plan, who always carried a second hard drive in his pocket. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, he was going home to his daughter. He got into his old car, a silver sedan with a dent in the passenger door, and a child's car seat in the back. He started the engine. He pulled out of the parking lot. He drove through the city streets, past the tall buildings and the crowded sidewalks, past the restaurants and the shops and the people heading home. He pulled up to the curb in front of his house. The lights were on inside. Through the window, he could see Margaret Chen, her silver-gray hair pulled back in its low bun, standing in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. And there, on the living room floor, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, was Lily. Her curly blonde hair was falling across her face. She was wearing the dress with the hand-stitched daisies. She was coloring in a book, her small hand moving across the page, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Ethan turned off the engine. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, watching his daughter through the window. The blue nightlight in the hallway cast a soft glow against the wall. The hand-stitched daisies on her dress caught the light from the living room lamp. The small pulse in her wrist, which he could feel even from here, even through the glass, beat steadily, reliably, like a clock that had never stopped.